My question is to the Minister representing the Minister for the Environment, Senator Canavan. Can the Minister outline the expected change in greenhouse gas emissions, including from land use change and forestry, in China between 2005 and 2030? What is the percentage change, and what is the absolute change in terms of tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalent?
The Minister representing the Minister for the Environment, Senator Canavan.
Thank you, Mr President, and I thank Senator Leyonhjelm for his question and for some advance notice of it. Mr President, as I'm sure this chamber is aware, the Paris Agreement is a collective response to the global threat of climate change. It is signed by a number of countries, including China. China's commitment is, under the agreement, to reduce its emissions intensity as an economy by 60 to 65% below 2005 levels. The advice I have, Mr President, however, is that China does not have official projections of their 2030 emissions, so I'm unable to provide a specific answer to Senator Leyonhjelm's question. China is, however, one of the largest investors in renewable energy in the world, committing, I think, $130 billion to clean energy technologies, and it is responsible for over half of solar installations in the world. Of course, China is experiencing above-average economic growth, which is a good thing for the world. That does, of course, also mean it has growth in emissions and reflects why its commitment is in terms of emissions intensity, not an absolute number or level of emissions.
Senator Leyonhjelm, supplementary question.
Thank you, Mr President. It probably is no surprise to the Minister that I actually know the numbers. I'll give them to you afterwards. Can the Minister outline the expected change in greenhouse gas emissions from 2005 and 2030, between 2005 and 2030 in India, including land use change and forestry, both in percentage terms and in terms of tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalent?
Senator Canavan.
Thank you, Mr President. Well, like China, India has also ratified the Paris Agreement, and similarly like China, its commitment is in terms of emissions intensity of 33 to 35% on its 2005 levels. Like China, India is growing very, very strongly. In fact, I believe it is the fastest-growing major economy in the world at the moment. So as it grows and hopefully moves to the category of developed nations, its emissions will increase, and its commitments are in terms of its percentage of emissions per economic output, not absolute numbers of emissions like Australia's. India is on track to overachieve its 2020 targets under the previous agreement. I should have mentioned, I think it was remiss of me to mention, China is also on track to meet its 2020 target as well. India likewise has significant, substantial ambitions to increase its renewable capacity by 227 gigawatts by 2022, and it's on track to achieve that. They are a very strong
Senator Canavan.
Sorry.
Senator Leyonhjelm, a final supplementary question.
Thank you, Mr President. The government wants Australian greenhouse gas emissions between 2005 and 2030 to fall by 26%. My information is that this represents a reduction in absolute terms of 156 tonnes. My calculation is that Chinese emissions increases over that period will be between 15 and 40 times Australia's. India's between 26 and 47 times Australia's emissions.
Order.
Can the Minister
Senator
provide
Leyonhjelm,
similar
time
advice?
for the asking the question has expired. I'll call Senator Canavan to respond to that asked. Senator Canavan.
Well, thank you, Mr President. As I did mention, I have received advance warning of this question, so I can provide some information for the senator. Mr President, first to just point out Australia's commitment to reduce emissions is to reduce it on a budget from 2021 to 2030, and so the figures I have are slightly different type than what Senator Leyonhjelm has just quoted. I've been advised that our commitment is an amount of 868 million tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalent under that methodology. As I mentioned, China and India, we don't have official projections for their emissions. On Indonesia, they have committed to reduce emissions by 29 to 41%. From business as usual, that will lead to 1692 to 2037 million tonnes of carbon dioxide emissions. And on Iran, there is no official emission profiles for that country.